February 4, 1944, 03, 27 hours, OKW headquarters, Zossen, Germany. The snow outside didn't matter, not when your command was bleeding from the inside. General Alfred Jodel's cigarette had long burned out between his fingers, but he hadn't noticed. The map table before him was littered with decrypted intercepts, casualty reports, and something new. A thin stack of teleprinter messages stamped Sondermeldung, nur für den Führer, special message, for the Führer only. But they hadn't come from the Eastern Front. These hadn't even passed through German lines. They were British transcripts, full word-for-word copies of German communications. The room was silent save for the soft whir of fans from the Lawrence SZ-40 cipher machines nearby, sleek, intimidating beasts with miles of cable and gears inside, which had supposedly made the Reich's communications unbreakable. And yet here they were, staring at their own words repackaged, decoded, and handed back to them by a British mole. They didn't know who, they didn't know how, but by that hour the generals knew one thing for certain. The enemy was inside their wires. Jodl turned to General Warlimont, his voice clipped low. "How much do they know?" Warlimont didn't answer. He just passed another folder across the desk. It was marked with a single British word on the front in all caps. Ultra. And then the smell hit them, something sharp, acrid. Not smoke, not fuel, ink. The smell of fresh printing from a British field station, somewhere in the south of England, perhaps. The British were intercepting encrypted Enigma traffic in real time, translating it, printing it, and sending it to commanders in the field before German officers had even read the originals. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was inside the folder. German orders, troop positions, shipment details, redeployment plans, all marked with red pencil by some Allied analyst. Advance Gruppe Steiner to Berglarien. They knew this before we even moved. Jodl rubbed his temples. This was 3 days ago. They ambushed the convoy. It wasn't a coincidence. And it wasn't the first. The pattern had started months earlier. September 1943, a Wehrmacht battalion moving through southern Italy vanished in an ambush. No radio intercepts had been sent. Orders had been handwritten and carried by motorcycle courier. Yet somehow, the Allies had been waiting on the exact hillside, with air support. December, a submarine group repositioned from Lorient was intercepted in the Bay of Biscay hours after leaving port. January, a new fuel supply route through Vichy, France was bombed before it became operational. 1 incident was chance, 2 coincidence. But by February, even the most hard-headed Nazi officers had to admit something was wrong with the entire intelligence chain. Weeks earlier, they'd blamed it on double agents. Abwehr agents were interrogated. Some were shot. Others were planted with false intelligence and fed back into enemy hands. But every time the Allies reacted to the real information, not the bait. Now Jodl was convinced. It wasn't men. It was machines. And the scent in the air, the strange faint heat, wasn't from any German printer. In a bunker beneath Bletchley Park, 900 kilometers away, rows of British women in uniform operated mechanical monsters that screamed and clanked through hundreds of encrypted messages an hour. Alan Turing, S-bomb machines, dozens of them now, worked round the clock to shatter what Germany believed unbreakable. Each message cracked wasn't just a victory in the intelligence war. It was a nail in the coffin of German confidence. Germany's war was no longer secret. On the wall of the OKW command center, an officer removed a map of France. Behind it, something else had been pinned, lines connecting dates, messages, raids. A chart of failures. "Every time we send something encrypted," Warlimont muttered, "they're waiting." Jodl stood slowly. "Then we are broadcasting our own destruction." There was a long silence. And then finally he whispered, "We are not at war with Britain. We are at war with ghosts." The door opened. Field Marshal Wilhelm Cadel stepped inside, his voice cut like a razor. "We just lost another column outside Avranches. Bombers were waiting, same as before." He threw down a packet. Encrypted German orders, decoded, annotated, stamped with British routing codes. Another ghost had read their mind. Outside, a low grumble rattled the frost-covered windows. Some assumed it was distant artillery. But Jodl, whose ears had lived through Stalingrad, knew better. It was a bomber formation, high above the clouds, invisible in the early dawn. They were already coming. By the end of February 1944, a quiet panic had taken root in the marble-floored corridors of the Reich Chancellery. Not the fire and fury hysteria that marked Hitler's rants after Stalingrad. No, this was colder, a silent acknowledgement between generals and staff officers, exchanged not in words, but in glances over maps that no longer made sense. Arrows that vanished overnight, regiments erased before arriving, convoys intercepted in places they shouldn't have been known. "Too many coincidences," murmured Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in a late-night meeting at La Roche-Guyon. After learning that British forces had shelled a fuel depot he'd only authorized by hand, in person, 2 days prior. "Either our thoughts are being read, or our machines are speaking in tongues." And yet no sabotage had been uncovered. No defectors. No microphones in command rooms. Just outcomes, perfect, surgical Allied outcomes, each preceded by German confidence in the invincibility of their encrypted communications. The Enigma machine was sacred. More than that, it was scripture. A chunky, metal-clad device with 3 rotors, a lamp board, and a plug board that resembled a telephone switchboard. To the Germans, it wasn't just code, it was faith. Every day, the code books changed. Every message had a unique configuration. There were more than 150 quintillion possible combinations for a single message. And yet, somehow, someone or something was listening. March 1, 1944, Lorient Naval Base. The radio officer aboard U-534 tapped in a weather report using the day's Enigma settings. Wind from the northwest. Visibility 5 kilometers. Light cloud cover. Message length 19 words. At a small, windowless facility outside London, known only by its code designation, Hut 6, a bank of electromechanical machines began clicking within the hour. Within 7 minutes, the German transmission was printed, fully decoded, in English. But in Berlin, the rot began from within. Officers began to whisper of betrayal. Some claimed the Allies had bribed Swiss engineers or seduced Polish mathematicians. Others, more fanatical, accused the Luftwaffe of leaking data to British airmen during prisoner exchanges. Internal security was doubled, then tripled, but the bleeding continued. Every intercepted order wasn't just a tactical loss. It eroded the psychological spine of the Reich. One example struck particularly deep. On March 5, a new Tiger tank unit was rerouted to southern Belgium by encrypted directive, only to be caught in a perfectly timed Allied mine trap hours after disembarking the train. Only 6 people had known the route. And yet, British sappers had already buried charges along the embankments, precisely at the curve where the tanks were to roll off. It no longer mattered how secret the messages were. If the machine was sending it, they were hearing it. Hitler refused to believe it. At the Wolf's Lair, he screamed into the receiver of his secure line, "I do not care what the generals say. The Enigma is flawless. The failure is human." But for once, his shouting couldn't bend reality. Because miles away, Allied analysts had already read that very outburst hours before it ended. They even knew what brand of cigar he had stubbed out in rage, thanks to a half-joking note from a captured aide-de-camp. passed through MI5. Deep in Bletchley Park, Alan Turing stared at a blackboard covered in chalk dust equations. His machines were no longer working in the abstract. They were breaking men, not just ciphers. He said little. His assistant, a young woman named Joan Clark, put it more clearly. "We are cutting the head off the snake one message at a time." The Allies now knew everything. Ship deployments, weather patterns, supply shortages, even the number of horses allocated for transport divisions in Poland. The intelligence was so rich that British command had to deliberately ignore some decrypts to avoid alerting the Germans to their advantage. Churchill had given explicit orders: use it only where necessary, never too often, or they'll smell the leak. But the Germans had already begun to sniff it. Somewhere in the haze of their arrogance, they'd caught the scent of decay. It was Admiral Dönitz, of all people, who came closest to naming it. At a U-boat strategy meeting in Berlin, he slammed his fist down and shouted, "They are not reading our minds, they are reading our letters." But when asked by his staff if he meant metaphorically or literally, he said nothing, just walked out. March 9, 1944, Abwehr headquarters. A memo arrived, top secret, hand-delivered by an SS courier. Its contents were blunt. Enemy possesses methods of intercepting and decoding high-level encrypted messages. Communications via Lawrence and Enigma no longer secure. Immediate action required. Cadel didn't believe it. Goebbels mocked it. Himmler ordered the courier shot for causing panic. And yet, every day, more confirmed examples piled up. Explosions followed coded orders like wolves chasing scent. Then came the final blow. April 10, 1944, a new German push near Caen was to begin, known only to a dozen staff officers and encrypted via Lawrence, the Reich's highest-level cipher. The message was never spoken aloud, never written by hand, only passed once through a secure teleprinter. And yet, 3 hours before the attack, British artillery had already zeroed the coordinates. The Germans didn't even make it to the tree line. From a nearby hill, a British officer lit a cigarette, turned to his adjutant and muttered, "They're still using Enigma." That night at Zossen, Jodl called an emergency session. No aides, no runners, just 6 generals and a single oil lamp in a sealed room. He placed a British message on the table, a decoded German order, sent the day before. His voice was hoarse. "They don't need spies. The machine is the spy." Warlimont rubbed his forehead. "Then we are deaf, blind, and naked." One officer asked, "Should we return to couriers, messenger pigeons?" Silence. Until Jodl whispered, "Pigeons would be more secure." From that day on, the German High Command stopped trusting Enigma. Not officially. The machine remained on desks, messages still tapped and clicked. But the real orders, the ones that mattered, were now often spoken in forests, handwritten, carried in boots. Too little, too late. The Allies already knew the pattern. They didn't need every message anymore, just enough to know where the heart was beating. And it was slowing. By May, even Hitler had stopped barking orders via teleprinter. His final directives came via sealed scrolls and furious, handwritten margins on maps. But the damage had been done. Entire divisions were ghosted by intelligence leaks. Paratroopers landed behind enemy lines before enemy lines were even drawn. The D-Day deception campaigns, Operation Fortitude, Bodyguard, and Glimmer, would succeed because Germany could no longer tell what was real, not just outside, but inside their own walls. And perhaps the cruelest irony, they never cracked the British equivalents. Ultra was one-sided. And by the time they realized it, their fate was already sealed, in messages they themselves had sent. May 1944, The ghost of Enigma loomed larger than any Allied tank. Across German command centers, the rhythmic clatter of encrypted transmissions had grown quieter, slower, not from lack of orders but from paranoia. The machine that once symbolized control now cast doubt. It was no longer a shield. It was a mirror, and somewhere across the channel, a shadow was watching from the other side. The highest-ranking officers, Rundstedt, Rommel, Kluge, began referring to it obliquely in conversation. If this is another echo, before we give them another invitation, we'll speak of this without wires. That was how the fear had evolved. It no longer needed proof, only suggestion. Commanders now second-guessed their own orders not because they were unsound, but because they knew the Allies would hear them. And that fear, that crushing, invisible knowledge, was now playing directly into Allied hands. June 2, 1944, Bletchley Park, England. A young analyst named Thomas Leach ran his fingers across a decrypted message from Berlin. He blinked twice, handed it to his supervisor. They've paused all Enigma traffic to Western fronts for 36 hours. That had never happened before. The supervisor's brow furrowed. Why? No one could say. Maybe the Germans were testing a new code system. Maybe they'd discovered a double agent. Maybe they were trying to sever the tap. But in the end, the reason didn't matter. Because in that silence, the Allies heard everything. While the Germans groped in the dark for new encryption methods, the Allies executed their final deception. Operation Bodyguard. They would make Hitler believe the invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And they would use his own distrust to achieve it. Through a ballet of fake transmissions, false agents, and planted radio chatter, all timed to mimic authentic German unit movements, they built an entire phantom army, First U.S. Army Group under General Patton. It existed on paper, in staged recon photos, in radio broadcasts sent directly into German listening posts. And crucially, it never referenced Enigma. It bypassed the machines entirely. But the Germans bought it, because by now they no longer knew which information could be trusted, even their own. Ultra didn't just break codes, it warped reality. June 5, 1944, night before D-Day. Inside the German 15th Army headquarters near Calais, General Hans von Salmuth reviewed intercepted British naval traffic, decoded via a secondary system. "There's chatter," his aide whispered. "Movement near the channel." Salmuth exhaled. "Good. It matches the Enigma transmissions from 3 days ago." He circled a target on the map, Pas-de-Calais. "They'll land here, send a report to Ob West, and hold the Panzer reserves." But miles away in a darkened room at SHAEF headquarters, British and American officers were already reading this conversation, word for word, courtesy of yet another ultra-decrypt. General Eisenhower didn't even blink. They'd done it. Germany would be facing the wrong direction when the storm came. June 6, 1944, Normandy. When the first Allied paratroopers dropped behind German lines at 16 hours, the Germans were still interpreting the previous day's intercepts, which spoke only of exercises and coastal misdirection. By dawn, 5 beachheads were aflame. German radio operators frantically tapped out messages using compromised Enigma ciphers, while Allied bombers dodged flak based on German orders they had already read. One Panzer officer screamed into a field radio. How the hell did they know where the mines were? No one answered. His signal had been sent, intercepted, read, and used before his tanks had even moved. Back in Berlin, the corridors were silent. No radio reports came from Kahn, no updates from Cherbourg. The eastern offices of the OKW smelled of cold steel, stale coffee, and something bitter, the stench of a war already lost, while they still believed it could be won. Inside the Führerbunker, Cadel held a document in shaking hands. It was an intercept, a British analysis of a German troop movement near Omaha Beach marked Ultra. He slammed it on the desk. They knew they always knew. Goebbels refused to look at it. "We must have traitors," he muttered, eyes unfocused. But even now, they refused to name the ghost aloud. Because once they did, once they admitted Enigma was compromised, they had nothing left to believe in. June 7, 1944, the aftermath. Rommel, surveying the chaos, stood on a coastal ridge near Bayeux, binoculars shaking in his hand. The American forces had punched through German machine gun nests with shocking precision, as if they'd known the exact angles, trenches, and fallback positions. He knew this wasn't just the power of numbers or courage. It was information, his information weaponized. He turned to his adjutant. "Find out where our last transmission was routed." "Through Lawrence, sir." Rommel closed his eyes. Then it was in their hands before our own men read it. Behind the lines, German clerks began to burn codebooks. Enigma machines were thrown into rivers. Cables were cut. And still, Allied aircraft moved like they had maps drawn in heaven. No matter what the Reich tried, every attempt to hide had already been seen. Back in England, inside Hut 3 of Bletchley Park, analysts huddled around a growing stack of decrypted orders. Some were typed, some were still warm from decoding. One had blood on it, recovered from a downed courier plane. Each message had the same tone: confusion, desperation. Requesting confirmation of Field Marshal Kluge's new orders, contradictory to prior directive. Panzer reserves immobilized due to conflicting authorization. Our allies confirmed in Calais or Normandy. No one replied. Because the Germans were asking questions to themselves, and the answers had already been taken from them. At Allied headquarters, General Omar Bradley held a sheet in his hand. German troop movement data, accurate, time-stamped, and decrypted by Ultra. He turned to his intelligence officer and asked, "They're still transmitting like it's safe?" The officer smiled. Some of them still trust Enigma. Bradley exhaled. "Let them, that machine is our best spy." But across the channel, that same machine was now being viewed with quiet horror. Officers stared at its keys, its clacking rotors, the soft light of the lampboard, like it was no longer a tool but a traitor. One SS major even refused to touch it. He muttered to his staff, "It's listening to us, not for us." In a last-ditch effort, Hitler ordered the development of a new cipher protocol, the Geheimschreiber. But it was too complex, too late, and already cracked by British cryptanalysts using the Colossus machine, the world's first programmable electronic computer. The Germans didn't just lose the encryption war. They'd never been in the lead. And that realization, quiet, shameful, infected every corner of the Reich's strategic planning in the final months. Even in retreat, they couldn't move in secret. Ultra followed them like a shadow, reading every command, every shift, every desperate relocation of fuel and artillery. It knew before they knew. And the German generals, they stopped asking how. They simply accepted it, like a sentence passed down by unseen judges. August 1944, the fall of Normandy. The German front was collapsing. Across the twisted hedgerows and scorched towns of northern France, officers from the Wehrmacht's 7th Army tried to rally what little strength they had. But there was no rhythm to their defense, no tempo, no trust in the chain of command. Orders changed by the hour. Artillery was fired blindly, often on empty fields. Fuel shipments vanished into firebombed rail depots, and every attempt to reinforce a crumbling sector ended with columns ambushed before they reached the first turn. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, stood beside a field radio in a half-destroyed farmhouse near Falaise. Sweat ran down the inside of his collar. His right hand trembled as he read the latest transmission from OKW. It was nonsense. Advance elements of Panzergruppe E to support breakout northwest of Argenton. But Panzergruppe E had already been cut off. That order made no sense unless it wasn't meant to make sense. Unless it was being written for someone else's eyes. Von Kluge turned to his aide. Send nothing by machine. From now on, nothing moves unless I say it out loud to the man riding the damn truck. The aide hesitated. Herr Feldmarschall, Berlin is demanding hourly reports. Von Kluge's eyes narrowed. Berlin can keep shouting into the void. We've been fighting with our trousers down since Sicily. It was true. Since the summer of 1943, the war in Italy had revealed the first real cracks. German convoys were struck as if Allied planes had the schedules. Communications outposts were silenced before a word of warning could be transmitted. And in Anzio, one officer had reportedly been heard shouting, moments before dying in an artillery barrage. They knew exactly where I was standing. But in France, it became systematic. Ultra wasn't just finding German units. It was finding commanders, fuel points, munitions caches, even airstrips under camouflage netting. The Allies weren't fighting with guesswork. They were fighting with maps the Germans had drawn themselves. September 1944, Aachen. With American armor pressing on the Siegfried Line, a group of German generals gathered in the cellar of a church now converted into a command post. The mood was funereal. A young signals officer entered with a clipboard. Message from Ob West, encrypted, Lawrence cipher. General Blumentritt, gray-haired, eyes like stone, waved him off. Put it with the others. Another officer spoke. Shall we decode it? Blumentritt looked at him with something between disgust and pity. Do you honestly think whatever that message says will change anything? He asked quietly. No one answered. In Berlin, the mood was equally grim. For weeks, intelligence officers had tried to convince Hitler that the Allies possessed no such capability, that Enigma remained secure. But Goebbels had stopped using it altogether. Even Himmler, once the most fanatical believer in Reich supremacy, now dictated his most sensitive orders by courier, using a network of messengers who were personally vetted and never briefed. Still, it wasn't enough. Even when nothing was said over the air, the Allies somehow moved to intercept. Rail hubs were bombed just before troop trains arrived. New command posts were shelled before they had signs outside. Ammunition columns disappeared in valleys where no reconnaissance plane had flown. It was as if the Allies could see through rock, through time. The generals didn't believe in magic. They knew the truth was worse. It was math. It was rows of women typing at lightning speed in England. It was circuits and punch cards. It was men like Turing, who never held a rifle, bringing down whole armies with thought alone. And the Germans had no answer to that. One moment in particular broke their faith entirely. October 3, 1944, Arnhem Bridge. A German counteroffensive was staged to dislodge British paratroopers still clinging to one side of the ruined bridge. Orders were encrypted, passed through secure Lawrence lines, and hand-delivered by mounted couriers. Yet when the German troops advanced, precisely at 500 hours, they were met with artillery already pre-sighted, machine gun fire from concealed flanks, and a perfectly timed airstrike that tore through their second wave. Casualties were catastrophic. Afterward, the surviving colonel returned to HQ in shock. We weren't just ambushed, he whispered to his superior. They knew our fallback route too. How? The general asked. The colonel only said one word: ghosts. Back in Bletchley Park, no one cheered. Victory wasn't something they toasted, it was processed. Every day, thousands of intercepted messages were decrypted and sent to Allied command. Most were cold, some were chilling. We are falling back to Line B. Fuel reserves below 30%. High Command has lost radio contact with the 352nd. But every now and then, one would arrive written not as a report, but as a cry. Where are our reinforcements? We request any support, anyone. Do they know everything? Those messages were never shared with the public. But those were the ones that stuck with the analysts. Because they proved it wasn't just soldiers being crushed, it was hope. November 1944, the Ardennes. As Hitler prepared his final desperate counterattack, what would become the Battle of the Bulge, a strange directive was issued. No radios, no encrypted orders, no Enigma traffic. Only spoken commands, messengers, and visual signals. The plan relied entirely on surprise. And for a moment, it worked. The Allies were caught off guard. The ultra-taps went silent, and panic briefly spread in British and American command. What are they hiding? Eisenhower asked. Why so quiet? It wasn't until tanks began rolling through the forest that the answer became clear. But even then, Ultra began to recover. German logistics officers, believing the new secrecy unnecessary, resumed sending encrypted updates about fuel shortages and delays. And within 48 hours, Allied analysts were reading reports about broken Panther engines, depleted SS columns, and command breakdowns before the German commanders had even fixed the problems. The offensive sputtered. The ghost had returned. And this time, it knew the script before the curtain had even risen. Back in Germany, the myth of Enigma was dead. The machine sat in corners of offices, silent. Some were smashed, others were dismantled and dumped into canals. One high-ranking SS officer was heard muttering as he tossed his machine into the Rhine. "You lied to us." But the machine had never lied. It had simply been heard by someone smarter. December 1944, Hitler, once surrounded by maps and wires, now paced alone with scrawled orders in trembling hands. Every trusted line was broken. Every command echoed into nothing. He could no longer shout across a continent and expect his words to be heard only by allies. Because for 2 years, every whisper he made had reached London first. And in that silence, surrounded by snow and ruin, Hitler finally understood what his generals had come to realize long ago. The Allies hadn't just outfought them, they had outread them. We now move to Part 5, the final part. Part 5 of 5, final part of the script, when Hitler's generals realized the Allies were reading every secret they sent. January 1945, Zossen, Germany. Snow drifted across the once bustling military headquarters in Zossen like ash over a battlefield. The vast underground nerve center, built to be bomb-proof, self-sufficient, a masterpiece of Nazi engineering, now felt like a tomb. A staff major moved briskly through the corridor. Under his arm, a bundle of freshly decoded signals, not British, not American, German. Each one had been intercepted, transcribed, and returned to the Reich's own command network via neutral backchannels. It was humiliation wrapped in carbon paper. The major entered a conference room where the last loyalists still gathered, Cadel, Jodl, a few others graying, thinner, coats buttoned tight not from cold but from shame. He laid the papers down. This came from Bern. Swiss monitors picked it up and passed it back. The British leaked it deliberately. Cadel opened the folder. On top was a translation of a German message, sent via Enigma 3 days prior. A routine request for troop strength in Königsberg, nothing sensitive, but attached was a redacted page. A British assessment of the same message. Minor request. Delay in response suggests local command breakdown. Recommends strategic redirection of bombing to rail depot at Prusks. Jodl exhaled, low and slow. They're not even hiding it anymore. No one spoke. The enemy had stopped pretending to be deaf. The last veil had been lifted. And now the only question left was, how long had they been listening? In truth, it had begun before the war did. Before Poland, before France. Even in 1939, Polish cryptographers had quietly handed the British their breakthroughs in decoding Enigma's early models. Men like Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosiecki, and Henryk Zygalski, names that Hitler would never hear, had broken the myth of German invincibility before a single boot had crossed the Vistula. And from that seed, Britain built a weapon of silence. Not a bomb, not a tank, but a listening post. A trap for every German thought spoken in wires. February 1945, Bletchley Park. It was quiet. The machine still clicked, the women still typed, but now the pages they printed described a dying empire. Division 11 retreating under heavy fire. Civilians flooding roads near Dresden. High Command unable to reach Silesia units, radio silence or collapse. The words had lost their heat. There was no longer strategy in them, only surrender in slow motion. In one decrypted message, a German colonel wrote to a superior, "They seem to know our movements before we make them. Are our souls also transparent?" No one at Bletchley responded. They just filed it. There was no joy in it. Only a quiet record of an enemy who had spoken too loudly for too long. March 1945, inside the Führer bunker. Hitler was a shadow. His voice, once volcanic, now trembled with exhaustion. He no longer trusted anyone with orders. He scribbled them in pencil, thrust them into the hands of aides, and made them repeat them back to him, twice, 3 times to ensure no mistake. But even then they failed. Because by that point, the Allied bombers were not striking based on Enigma decrypts. They were striking based on habit, on rhythms learned from 2 years of reading the enemy like a diary. The Allies didn't need his voice anymore. They could anticipate his movements without hearing them, because they had read the Reich's entire playbook in real time. One final insult came just days before the collapse. A German general, desperate to preserve one last armored train bound for Austria, sent a heavily encrypted request for safe rail passage. The order was routed only once, via a hardened line. The cipher used was one of the last experimental variants, thought to be unbreakable. 4 hours later, the train was destroyed by a direct airstrike outside Brno. Not by chance. By choice. Someone had read the order. And this time, there wasn't even a pretense of surprise. April 1945, the end. In the final days, Hitler's generals no longer trusted wires, machines, or even messengers. They spoke face to face, in bunkers, in whispers. And even then, they looked over their shoulders. They no longer feared the man in front of them. They feared the man across the sea, in a room full of cables and gears, who had been reading every one of their secrets before they themselves understood them. When the war ended, Allied soldiers overran Zossen. They found Enigma machines piled in corners, some smashed, some wired for demolition. In one office, a soldier found a note taped to the wall, scribbled in haste. "The machine betrayed us." But that wasn't true. The machine had only ever done what it was told. It had spoken clearly, efficiently, beautifully. It was the Germans who didn't understand that someone else was listening. Epilogue: Bletchley Park, post-war. The rooms were dismantled, the tapes burned, the machines silenced. Men and women who had helped shape victory never spoke of what they did. They went home, became teachers, clerks, mothers, engineers. The world never heard the full story. Not for decades. And by then, most of the German officers who had once ruled Europe had long passed, still haunted, in their final days, by a single question. How did they always know? Because they'd sent the answer themselves. Typed, encrypted, and handed unknowingly to their enemy. Over and over and over. Until the war was not lost on the battlefield, but in the wires, in the machine, in the silence that was never really silent.